Miller, host of the Reconciling Ways of Knowing online forum series, joining you today from the territory of the Lekwungen and WSÁNEĆ peoples, where I'm grateful to be able to live, work, and study. Today and this weekend, Reconciling Ways of Knowing has partnered with the IISAAK OLAM Foundation to bring you a Valentine's Zaagi'idiwin virtual celebration and discussion series. Today, we will focus on Zaagi'idiwin and other Indigenous conceptions of love and how we can enact truly intersocietal relationships with each other across ways of knowing and ways of being, decolonizing our relationships to each other and the world in which we live together. Before we turn to the session itself, I have a few quick housekeeping notes. We've turned the chat feature off, although the Q&A box will remain open. We don't have an official Q&A period today, but we'll instead turn to you for your questions and thoughts much more extensively tomorrow and Sunday. If you can't make it either day, you can share your questions with us via the Q&A box today, and we will work to address them through the ongoing discussions this weekend. Today's session will run for approximately 2 hours. We're recording the session and we'll share a compilation from the 3-day event soon after via both of our organization's websites and social media. And I'm now pleased to introduce our moderator for today, Eli Enns, who will begin the official event. Eli Enns is an internationally recognized expert in Indigenous-led conservation from the Tlaqueña Nation on his father's side and of Dutch Mennonite heritage on his mother's side. Eli promotes holistic solutions for community and ecosystem health and well-being. With a background in political science, Eli is a nation builder with values and approaches rooted in Indigenous economic theory and practice. Eli is the co-founder and president of the IISAAK OLAM Foundation. Over to you, Eli.
Thank you, Jackie. Yeah, and I'm so happy to be here with all of you. I think that the Valentine's Zaagi'idiwin Day event is going to not only sort of ease us in 2021 with the COVID pandemic and a lot of us being following the orders of the government, so to speak, and staying home. But I think that this is going to be an annual event. So I'm really excited about bringing it to you this year. And I'm very honored to introduce Elder Larry Mcdermott, who's going to open us up in a good way. I've known Larry, I guess it's since 2012, and we've been on all kinds of adventures since then. And every time I hear Larry speak, I learn something new. He's just an encyclopedia and vault of good knowledge. And so Larry, I thank you so much for being with us today, and hand it over to you to open us up.
Miigwech, Eli. Great to be with you, with the whole team, and Miigwech for the hard work that's gone into making this happen today. And of course, I'm hoping you'll tell the story about how this was created. I was sitting in my recliner chair, nursing my shoulder, and I actually made it to New Year's Eve for the first time in 15 years because the conversation was so great, and that's where the birth of this idea emerged. So let me just move into our opening. Kwekwe Kijimanadu, Uamsi, Indigenous Cost, Makwa and Dodam, Shabbat Bajwan, First Nation and Digaba. Kwe Wabanung, Kwe Shawananung, Kwe Ipangish Kamoj, and Kwe Kiwe Dinung. Kikidan Jojo Aki, Mimega Umana Pimadaziwan, Kakina Kego Gazarian, and Anik Mishomas Beneng. And so I've thanked the ancestors, asked the ancestors to join us today, thank them, thank the Creator for all that's been created, and including those 7 grandfather teachings, one of which is love, and pronounced slightly different in Algonquin, but it's and really kudos to you, Eli, for I think the idea came from you, to celebrate the theme that we know in English as love. And I've actually since heard it in about 8 different Indigenous languages, and been thinking about the theme ever since. But I want to reflect on a process that the Pathways One process that, and of course, Eli, you were co-chair of the Indigenous Circle of Experts and produced We Rise Together. Chloe Dragon Smith um, uh, and a number of others, including Cliff Supernar, who unexpectedly passed away recently. I want to honor his spirit. I want to honor the love that he put into creating Canada's conservation vision, a parallel process, a complementary process. And I can remember Dr. Reg Crowshoe, who is the lead elder in overseeing a process that brought together Indigenous oral knowledge systems and Western written systems. A system that, for example, where the smudge and the gavel were equivalent, where those 7 gifts, one of which is love, and Robert's Rules of Order were brought together. And in drawing a schematic, we created an image for Canada's conservation vision, and it kind of had the Western written on one side, governments, the governments of Canada, provinces and territories. On the other side, Indigenous governments, Indigenous ways of knowing. And what Reg and I and Cliff came up with was to reshape the earth into a heart. I actually have moccasins that have been created since that time. And so in responding to Canada's treaty obligations, really under the 3 treaties, that being climate change, biodiversity, and desertification. And don't think of desertification as just sand blowing in deserts, but it's also the phenomenal loss of topsoil. 25% of the Earth's topsoil has been lost since 1970. That affects us all. And it means that the way our relationship literally with the land is part of those 3 treaties and needs to be thought of in conjunction with biodiversity loss and climate change. So in Canada's prioritization on how to best do our part in a global treaty circumstance, we came up with this co-governance model, and the Indigenous Circle of Experts, the National Advisory Panel, put forward recommendations. And so within Canada's conservation vision is this beautiful shaped heart, recognizing that transformation will come only, and it hasn't come since 1992. I was in Rio for the Earth Summit at that time. I was exceedingly optimistic. I thought it would happen much quicker, but here we are. And so what is the transformative quality that with great Western science will achieve that transformation? It's the heart. It's the spirit of connecting with the spirit of the land. It's that respect and love for one another. And that's where the creative energy will come to achieve that transformation. So it was in handing over those recommendations in We Rise Together in Canada's conservation vision, we did that through pipe ceremony, and which Minister McKenna joined us. We did gift giving, which is the highest level of honoring the spirit, recognizing that we are in circle. There's no hierarchy, that spirit and our creator has created us equal. And so we also shared our drum songs. It was wonderful working with Reg Crowshoe. I just got off the phone with Barry Sarrazin, who is the lead drum for the Algonquin drum. And so we spent a couple of days with Reg organizing our honor songs and organizing what I call international presentation of our love, our commitment, our respect for the land. With that story, I'm excited to hear what others have to say, to honored and privileged to be part of this. And I say chi miigwech to all of you for bringing your special gifts together today and for sharing them in a creative process motivated by our heart and bringing our heart and mind to this task. Back to you, Eli.
Thank you, Larry. Yeah, and thank you for bringing us back to New Year's Eve. For those of you who are with us then, you'll know that the inspiration for the Valentine's Zaagi'idiwin event came from New Year's Eve in a dialogue with Dr. David Suzuki, who we're going to be hearing from shortly, about the economy and about Indigenous protected and conserved areas, which is one of the main outcomes from the Pathway to Canada Target 1 that Larry speaks of, and about how IPCAs can actually improve Canada's economy and make it more resilient. And we got into this conversation about, well, why should we be concerned about the economy? And that led to a brief sort of consideration of the word economy itself as it's related to the words ecology and ecosystem, and how Indigenous concepts of abundance can help inform the way that we think about. We actually need to improve on this concept of sustainability. It's not enough just to sustain life or preserve life, for future generations. We must actively look at fostering more abundance. And there's all kinds of teachings in Indigenous knowledge systems and what I would call the elder societies of this earth. All over the world, there are elder societies who have these simple but powerful teachings about how to be in the world in a good way, how to not only be in the world with other human beings in a good way, but how to walk with the rest of creation, so to speak, the other charismatic species that we share this planet with. How can we do that? How can we do that in a better way, as informed by these values and principles of love? And of course, the teaching of Zaagi'idiwin, which I first started to become aware of at the opening of the Canadian Museum of Human Rights in Winnipeg, Manitoba. I was driving in a distant highway, losing my reception to CBC Radio 1, and hearing John Burroughs speak about how in the early days of treaty, this concept of Zaagi'idiwin was very much alive and active in our relationship development in creating this country that we know today as Canada. So Dr. John Burroughs is with us and others who will speak to that. But it really, for me, accelerated in 2018 when I heard Burroughs speak about Zaagi'idiwin to the Canadian Environmental Grantmakers Network annual general meeting in Banff, Alberta. And he explained how this idea of mutual love in human relations was inspired from observations of the natural world and this abundance that happens when a river enters into a lake, in that estuary where life is most prevalent and most abundant. And how can we be inspired by Mother Nature's economy, Mother Nature's abundance in our human relations? So I want to thank Dr. Burroughs and other folks like Larry who've been bringing these teachings to the world and to these governmental processes, which so often seem to be stripped of higher values of consideration, such as love, truth, and honor, and the teachings that the Anishinaabe Algonquin peoples bring to our society as great teachings. The last thing I'll say as I hand over to Dr. Suzuki is just that, these these concepts of love are actually, and we're going to be talking about over these 3 days, examples, tangible examples of how Zaagi'idiwin and other Indigenous concepts of love are driving the way, the decision-making of Indigenous peoples, and how we choose to create priorities for our endeavors. That these concepts, although living behind the scenes, have been an ever-present story of the unfolding of our relationship all the way back to first contact and significant treaties such as the Pledge of Allegiance that Larry Mcdermott has shared so much about between the Crown and Indigenous peoples. So with that, it's my great honor and pleasure to welcome Dr. David Suzuki to share some of his thoughts. So right over to you, David.
Oh, that was good. Thank you. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here today and share a few ideas with you. I want to begin by by recognizing that I'm speaking to you from the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations, who cared for these waters and lands for thousands of years and served as a genuine model of sustainability. So thank you again, Eli, for inviting me here and giving me the opportunity to share a few ideas with you. I congratulate you on the topic of this conference because it goes to the heart, I think, of the problems and the solution. What I would like to do is provide a perspective through the lenses of science as a scientist. You know, every culture has its creation stories, and now science adds to the story in that it extends back long before humans were even on this planet. And what an incredible, mind-boggling story it is. Scientists tell us 14 billion years ago, the universe didn't exist. There was nothing. All of what would, excuse me, become the universe was a point smaller than a period on a page of writing. Don't ask me what existed outside that point, or this is all way beyond me. But creation of everything begins with the Big Bang, according to scientists, 13.7 billion years ago, as energy exploded and spewed forth in the ultimate creation, and all the building blocks of matter, subatomic particles called quarks, formed and continued to rush away in an Tara, can you give me a glass of water? In an expanding universe that is still growing today. As I say, don't ask me how this all came about, or even how scientists know this. I'm not a physicist, and it all boggles my mind, but I just accept what they tell us. But what matters, excuse me, thanks. What matters is that while everything in an expanding universe is rushing away, every particle with mass exerts a pull on every other body with mass. Of course, these are infinitesimally tiny tugs of attraction. But if you try to imagine all those tiny forces of attraction, then the universe is not mostly empty space. It is, as I've written, filled with evanescent tendrils of attraction that some believe is the foundation of love. Earth was formed 4.5 billion years ago, and life evolved soon after, perhaps 3.9 billion years ago. For most of the time after life appeared on Earth, if we had a time machine and went back to that time, we would see nothing. All life would have been invisible to us because it was completely microbial for over half of the 3.9 billion years. It took billions of years for microbes to evolve all of the basic mechanisms of feeding, growing, dividing, and sexual reproduction that allowed shuffling of the genes. Now, a characteristic that distinguishes life from non-life is a membrane, a cell membrane that separates the inside from the outside. That membrane then allows in what the cell needs while forming a barrier against everything else that wants to get in. That membrane is a shield for every cell. During the 1960s, scientists made an amazing discovery. When two cells of different species are brought into close contact under certain conditions, they don't repel each other. In fact, they fuse into one. Even if you take an animal cell and a plant cell, you can fuse them, and the nucleus with the chromosomes in it will actually fuse as well. Is that love? When DNA of different organisms is compared, we find that in fact we share most of our DNA with every animal and plant, whether it's a cedar tree or a carrot plant, whether it's an eagle or a fish or a dog. We share most of our genes because we are all descended from the same primordial cell. All life is our kin. And surely we treat our relatives with greater care and love than if they are simply resources. Darwin's theory of evolution has been embraced by business, by politicians and economists as validation of competition. Competition is natural law. Nature, red in tooth and claw, eat or be eaten, predator and prey. That's a Darwinian world. But that's just one path that nature takes. Cooperation, sharing are every bit as vital a part of evolution's path as competition. Very early in evolution, when all life was microbial, bacteria invaded or were engulfed by other bacterial cells. In other words, the bacteria might find a way to eat that one over there and exploit them, or they might invade that cell and sit there taking advantage of their host cell. At first, they were like parasites, exploiting the host to live and reproduce, the way COVID-19 uses our cells. COVID-19 can't reproduce alone. It needs a living cell to get into, and then it takes over the metabolic machinery and starts pumping out more copies of COVID-19. But over time, those parasitic bacteria within bacteria began to do things their host could benefit from, could take advantage of. And so that relationship built up over time, and those invaders became structures we now call organelles. The most familiar are mitochondria that store and release energy, and chloroplasts in plants that contain chlorophyll and perform photosynthesis. Mitochondria and chloroplasts contain DNA that show they were originally bacteria. But now they are so tightly tied to their host cells that they no longer live independently. And there are other specialized organelles as well. But what that means is every cell in our body contains organelles, ancient bacteria that are part of us and that we depend on for our lives. And now scientists are finding our digestive system is full of bacteria. In fact, when you take a dump, most of that is bacteria that make up our microbial biome, and they're necessary to keep us healthy. Coral reefs, one of the examples of tremendous biodiversity. The reef itself is formed by polyps, which are animals, but they have incorporated plants into their protoplasm in the way that chloroplasts and mitochondria are in us. And those plants then photosynthesize and give energy, sugars, to the animals that are hosting them. When water temperatures rise, as they are now, the plants are most sensitive in the coral and they die. And the coral reefs bleach white. And then if that is sustained over more than a year, then they begin to die because they need the plants. Now, plants, of course, that are the base of all animal life. Plants can't move. So they evolved ways to attract animals that do move. You all know that, insects, bats, and mice to pollinate for them or to spread their seeds by eating them and then pooping in different parts of the forest. Trees themselves flourish because of mycorrhizal fungi, very different group of organisms that wrap around their roots to feed, and they absorb and feed the trees with water and nutrients. And those fungi in turn are fed by the photosynthetic products of the tree leaves. So you know, a fundamental interdependence of radically different groups of organisms. The tree roots themselves also touch the roots of other trees. And in fact, they're finding now they share food and water, even if the trees are a different species. So a tree is not just this individual character. The tree's health depends on the mycorrhizal fungi. And if there are other trees around, they are a community that are sharing information as well as nutrition. The great Harvard ecologist, Edward O. Wilson, says, we have what he calls an innate need to affiliate with other species. What does that mean? He calls it biophilia, love of life. And he says it's built in. We have a genetic need to affiliate with other species. And I've always watched as my children and then my grandchildren, when they're infants, if you show them a butterfly or a flower for the first time, or for that matter, a spider or a snake, you don't see them recoil with fear. You see instant interest, curiosity. Chances are they want to grab it and put it in their mouth. But that to me is biophilia. It's built into us. Study after study shows that we have a physical and psychological need for nature. In Japan, Shinrin Yoku is called, it means forest bathing. If you go for a walk out in the forest, that's covered by your medical plan, your medical insurance, because it's been found that when we walk in a forest, blood pressure immediately drops, tension falls away, immune systems strengthen. While children out in nature exhibit far less bullying, attention deficit, or hyperactivity. For most of human history, that's the way we were. We were out in nature. We were nomadic hunter-gatherers who carried everything we owned, following plants and animals through the seasons on their migrations. We lived within an ecocentric worldview. That means that we understood that we were one small strand in a very complex web of relationships with all other species of animals and plants, with air, water, soil, and sunlight. And we acknowledge these relationships in ceremony, rituals, songs, dance, and prayers in which we express love and thanks for the Creator's abundance and generosity and promise to act properly to keep it all going. That's the way we lived for 95% of our existence. The last 5% of our time here began 10,000 years ago with the agricultural revolution, and that changed the course of human history. With a reliable source of food, we could abandon our nomadic ways and settle into a more sedentary life. Permanent structures could be built and grew eventually into villages and towns. And as populations grew, diverse needs arose. We needed ranchers to deal with the animals. We needed carpenters and teachers, and I'm sure politicians very, very quickly in communities. Religion evolved to provide values to guide us in our individual behavior and interaction with others. And some, like Judeo-Christianity, elevated humans as different from all other life and special by virtue of our intelligence. A man, Jesus, was called the Son of God, but he was a human being. So we must be created in the image of God. And the Bible commands us in Genesis 1:28 to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. This is an anthropocentric way of seeing our place in the world. We are at the center. We are superior to everything, and everything revolves around us. It's just there for us to go and take, subdue, and manipulate and exploit it. Still, for most of the last 10,000 years, most people in the world were involved in some aspect of agriculture. And farmers know very well that we are part of and utterly dependent on nature through the seasons, the weather and climate, on pollination by insects, on nitrogen fixation by certain plants. They know that the amount of snow in the winter is directly related to how much moisture you got in the soil in the summer. Farmers understand that we are still absolutely embedded in nature. But our anthropocentrism, the idea that we're at the top, was reinforced in the Renaissance. Francis Bacon, who said, "Scientia potestas est." I took 4 years of Latin, totally useless, except when I recite a Latin phrase. Scientia potestas est. Knowledge is power. Knowledge that could be harnessed, Bacon said, in the service of humankind. René Descartes wrote, "Cogito ergo sum." I think, therefore I am. This elevated, I believe, the mind out of the body. I mean, it's thinking that makes us who we are, but above the body, outside of and above the body. And Isaac Newton, he studied motion and gravity in the cosmos and showed that the planet Earth, the moon, the sun, and galaxies all behave according to laws of physics. Newton believed it showed that we live in a clockwork universe that behaves much like a mechanical entity. Every part of a clock has its place with a predictable role. So in a clockwork universe, by focusing on the components, the parts, we can eventually add them all together and understand the whole. This is the underlying assumption of reductionism, which is the primary approach of most scientists today. Reductionism is why biologists thought we could study a chimpanzee in a cage and know everything about the species, until Jane Goodall went out in the forest to study chimps in their natural habitat and discovered a totally different animal. They are intelligent. They are social. They use tools. They cooperate in hunting. They fight wars. Until very recently, psychologists studied humans in controlled settings, one-on-one in a room or in defined groupings. Then someone got the idea, the environment that we live and work and play in does have psychological effects. So finally, we have eco-psychology, you see, science thought, you just talk to a person and you can figure out everything that's wrong. Maybe our surroundings affect the way that we think and behave. When physicists began to study smaller and smaller particles of matter, they tell us that what they've learned is that in plants, in animals, in rocks, in water, animate or inanimate objects, they're all the same. When you get down to the very fundamentals, quarks of different kinds are assembled in different combinations to create the elements, and they make up everything. Nothing spiritual there. It's just matter. One big problem, though, with the reductionist approach is that it doesn't work. It's wrong. You know, physicists can learn all about the atomic properties of oxygen and the atomic properties of hydrogen. They can know it right down to the protons and neutrons and electrons and the quarks. But if we then ask, knowing what you know about oxygen and hydrogen, what are the properties when you combine 2 atoms of hydrogen with 1 atom of oxygen to make H2O or water? And the only honest answer is, I can't, or I don't know. Because when the atoms combine to form a molecule, new properties result from the interaction between the atoms that cannot be predicted on the basis of the properties of the individual atoms. The Nobel Prize winner Roger Sperry calls them emergent properties that reveal the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Yet reductionism is the way most science is performed, a belief that the whole is merely the sum of its parts. And when you get down to the smallest parts, it's all the same. It's just stuff. The Industrial Revolution reinforced the sense that we are special. Our intelligence allows us to escape the laws of nature. Telescopes let us see to the very edge of the universe. There's no biological creature on Earth that can do that on its own. With microscopes, we discover a world of life in a drop of water. To me, that says, man, are we ever ignorant if it takes a microscope to reveal something totally different. We have machines now that can work tirelessly, that can move enormous weights, drill through the Earth's crust, dive to the ocean depths, travel faster than the speed of sound, let us escape gravity to live in space. We're creating computers today that think at the speed of light 24/7. Can you imagine in a few years, they won't even be able to talk to us except in child speak, da, da, goo, goo. I mean, what will they be thinking? We're designing life forms, designing them according to our specifications, including our own children. We are geoengineering the planet to avoid climate change. And we're now proposing to terraform Mars, transform Mars into an Earth-like state so humans can live there. The only limit to our potential seems to be our imagination and productivity. Scientists are taught to study nature objectively, so you don't let your emotions or your biases affect what we do and how we interpret the results. When Jane Goodall did her famous studies of chimpanzees, she recognized individual animals and gave them names. And for that, she was heavily criticized because she was being emotional and anthropocentric. And that is considered bad science. I was still a professor at UBC doing research in genetics when I did a program for the nature of things on the fight against logging in Haida Gwaii. My film crew went up a day before me, and they were sitting in a restaurant having breakfast when they met a UBC professor, a botanist who was famous for his studies of bryophytes, plants found only in Haida Gwaii. When he found out that they were filming with me, he launched into a tirade saying I had no business being a university professor because I was getting caught up in a political issue. So here was a scientist whose reputation was based on plants that were going to be endangered by the practices of clear-cut logging, yet he wouldn't lift a finger. He wouldn't get involved because it would endanger his credibility as a scientist. The problem with the ideal of objectivity is that it means you no longer care for what you're studying. It's just a means to publish a paper, get a raise, or get promoted. You know, I used to be a fruit fly geneticist and spent long hours in the lab pushing flies. And often around 1 or 2 in the morning, the janitorial staff would come through and they always gave me a weird look saying, I mean, it seemed to say, what the hell are you doing at this time of night? So I'd often say, come on over here, have a look at what I'm doing. And it never failed. They were always blown away at the shock and the delight of seeing a fruit fly under the microscope. The eyes are a brilliant vermilion color. Then if you look at the backs, there are geometrically arranged rows of bristles and tiny hairs along the thorax. And you find all of that in the abdomen. And when you look at the genitalia and when you look at the end, I mean, they could sit there for hours, but they were janitors, right? This is the reason I went into science in the first place. As a boy, I had been an avid insect collector. I love beetles. But if I were to write a scientific paper and begin with, I am filled with wonder and awe at the splendid color of a fly's eyes, the mathematical precision of the arrangement of facets and the distribution of hairs on its back, the paper would be rejected, or I would have to cut out all passages like that. So there would be no hint of wonder or love. And when we focus on a part of nature, whether a subatomic particle, a molecule, or a cell, we lose sight of the context within which that fragment exists and matters. When Paul Mueller discovered that DDT kills insects, he won a Nobel Prize in 1948. People thought this is the greatest thing we can imagine to control pests. But you spray DDT in open fields, it rains, winds blow, it snows, DDT ends up in rivers and lakes and organisms where it's concentrated up the food chain. This is called biomagnification, a biological phenomenon that was only discovered when birds began to disappear, and biologists tracked down the cause. As you concentrated up the food, DDT, up the food chain, it tended to be in fatty tissue in a bird that was a shell gland. And so the shell glands of birds were causing eggshells to be thinner and they'd break when they were laid, and birds began to disappear. So again, when you focus in science, you lose sight of the bigger context within which that part exists. And, you know, we don't understand all of the bigger picture. When atomic bombs were dropped on Japan in 1945, scientists didn't know there was a thing called radioactive fallout. That was discovered when bombs were exploded over Bikini years later. They didn't know about electromagnetic pulses of gamma rays that emanate out from the explosion and knock out electrical circuits over a very wide area. They didn't know about the possibility of nuclear winter. When CFCs were found to be very useful and began to be used in refrigerators and spray cans, it was only years later that scientists discovered high up in the atmosphere, ultraviolet light from the sun breaks chlorine off the CFC, and chlorine scavenges the ozone layer. when I first heard that, I said, what ozone layer? I didn't even know there was an ozone layer up there to break down. Diethylstilbestrol, an artificial hormone that doctors were using when women who were pregnant went into early labor. They would give them DES to calm the contractions. In fact, one of my daughters was born after her mom had DES. Then years later, they discovered that females, daughters of women who took DES while they were pregnant, have a high incidence of cancer, uterine cancer. Thalidomide, again, an invention that was a sleeping drug used especially for pregnant women who are having trouble sleeping. And of course, we all know the terrible limb defects that were a consequence of thalidomide. We don't know enough. We're too ignorant, and we don't see the wider picture. The inadequacy of science is reflected by an initiative in 1990 by Carl Sagan called Preserving and Cherishing the Earth, an appeal for joint commitment in science and religion. It was signed by 32 Nobel laureates and many other eminent scientists. The open letter appeal was presented to the Global Forum of Spiritual and Parliamentary Leaders Conference in Moscow. 271 well-known spiritual leaders from 83 countries signed the appeal. And it read in part, quote, "The earth is the birthplace of our species, and as far as we know, our only home. When our numbers were small and our technology feeble, we were powerless to influence the environment of our world. But today, suddenly, almost without anyone's noticing, our numbers have become immense and our technology has achieved vast, even awesome powers. Intentionally or inadvertently, we are now able to make devastating changes in the global environment, an environment to which we and all other beings with which we share the earth are meticulously and exquisitely adapted." It listed problems like ozone depletion, global warming, deforestation, species extinction, and global nuclear war, and then continued, and I quote, "We are committing what in religious language is sometimes called crimes against creation, of which the long-term biological and ecological consequences we still are painfully ignorant. These crimes," the document says, "are transnational, transgenerational, and trans-ideological, and their solution requires a perspective that embraces the peoples of the planet and all the generations yet to come. We scientists, many of us long engaged in combating the environmental crisis, urgently appeal to the world's religious community to commit in word and deed to preserve the environment of the earth. Religious teaching, example, and leadership are able to influence personal conduct and commitment powerfully. As scientists, many of us have had profound experiences of awe and reverence before the universe. We understand that what is regarded as sacred is more likely to be treated with care and respect. Our planetary home should be so regarded. Efforts to safeguard and cherish the environment need to be infused with a vision of the sacred. There is a vital role for both religion and science. I say all this to put science into a perspective, to show that while very powerful, science provides a fragmented picture of the world that can never anticipate the behavior of the combined pieces. Not long ago, scientists were driven by a curiosity, by a desire to unlock some of the secrets of God's wonders. And in peeling back the layers of ignorance, they enhanced all the more their awe of God and his handiworks. but with the knowledge of the potential application of pure knowledge, especially the creation of nuclear bombs by the most pure and abstract of the sciences, quantum mechanics and physics, governments and corporations began to realize the immense power of Francis Bacon's statement that knowledge is power, and began to apply that effort to gain greater power or profit. It has been a terrible bargain because awful things are done in the name of power or profit. Traditional indigenous knowledge is fundamentally different from science. I know some call it indigenous science, but to me, that diminishes TK, which is far broader and profound than just science. To begin with, indigenous people would never look out at the world with detachment or objectivity. They are embedded in Mother Earth with a profound sense of love and gratitude. The consideration of other animals, even plants, as our relatives is not only corroborated by molecular biology, it carries a feeling of love and respect that science tries to scrub out. It's not only a sense of love, but a deep understanding that while we may depend on other species for our survival, they exist as beings with every bit as much of a right to existence and continuation as we have. Indigenous knowledge celebrates our immersion in nature. It is fundamentally subjective and enwrapped with love. TK is built from accumulated observations, trial and error, successes and mistakes handed down from ancestors. This is critical knowledge for survival, and the indication of its profundity is the fact that people have survived in place for thousands of years without the kind of destruction we see all around us today. So I believe it is indigenous knowledge that scientists like Carl Sagan were appealing for. The science is too restricted and needs that input, not necessarily from a religious group, as we see religion can also have its deleterious consequences. But I believe it is traditional indigenous knowledge that provides us with a framework through which we reestablish a relationship with the planet. I'm sorry, I've gone on way too long. I'll cut the last part of my talk here and just thank you for allowing me to share a bit of insight that I've learned as a scientist. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Suzuki. That was fantastic, and you hit all of the right points. And as you were speaking, at the beginning of your talk about the attraction between the microbial in the microbial environment over half of the duration of life on Earth, I thought about the analogy of the human body and how these microbial communities, and together with our organs, attract to each other and create our own and make our own life possible. That our life is possible because of that love among things that we don't fully understand and certainly don't always perceive. And then, when looking out at the stars and looking to other planets and other solar systems in our sort of insatiable pursuit of more, I was reminded of something that an elder had taught me years ago about the love of Mother Earth. And the exercise that we did was laying out on a piece of grass, anywhere where you can find some grass, to lay down and close your eyes and feel Mother Earth's gravity holding us close to her, and imagining how fast we're spinning and how fast we're moving through space and time, and yet how strong that mother's love is in holding us close to her and keeping us still and calm. But more importantly, keeping us strong as we know now that if we spend any amount of time in a weightless environment, in the International Space Station, for example, our muscle and bone starts to deteriorate because we don't have that constant pull of our mother's love, that we stand up and keep our bones and muscles strong as we are here on Earth. And so I thank you for illustrating that dynamic playing field of love. And I think it's a perfect lead into our first session coming up in 5 minutes. I know that Jackie's going to drop some important information in the chat. There it is. She's drawing the attention of the audience to upcoming sessions. Initially, when we envisioned this Zaagi'idiwin Valentine's Day event, we were just focused on Sunday the 14th, but it just created so much interest, and there were so many important perspectives that were brought out through discussions with special guests and speakers that we ended up expanding it to 3 days. So, and I know that's a huge commitment for a lot of people to make. But you know, any piece of it that you want to pick up, I think might be valuable. And as we transition into the first session, that I will first turn to Dr. John Burrows, I want to come full circle back, Dr. Suzuki, to New Year's Eve and the conversation we had about the economy. And you know, like there's been a few teachers in my life, but one of them on this subject of economy was in fact something I heard you say, Dr. Suzuki, about how the word economy itself has become so far from its original intent and meaning. When economists today talk about the economy as though it's a thing, we lose track of the origin story of that word in the elder society language of the Greek language, and how that word economy is related to the words ecology and ecosystem. And how could these indigenous concepts of love help inform better decision-making and better governance overall of our economy and our relationship to the natural world? So
Eli, I wonder if I could just take 2 minutes then to set you up for the next meetings. You know,
sure.
My wife and I have lived in this house for over 45 years. I'll give you an idea of where we are in Vancouver. And when I fell in love with my wife, I fell in love with her mom and dad, and invited them to come and stay with us in the house when they retired, which they did. I never thought they'd live as long as they did, but they finally, they both died in their late 90s here at home with us. Anyway, in the 1990s, when Hong Kong was going to revert to China, many Hong Kong people began to take their money and invest in Canada. And I got a letter in the mail from a real estate agent saying, offshore money is pouring into Vancouver. Now is a good time to sell your house and buy up. Now, I hadn't even been looking for selling. This is my home, right? I was pissed off, like, what the heck's going on? So I thought, oh, okay, you think you want to sell my home. So I say, we've lived here over 45 years. And so I began to write down, what are the things that give this value to me? And the first thing I wrote down was that when Tara and I got married, we lived in a small apartment. My dad was a cabinet maker. He built a kitchen cabinet for us. When I bought this house, we tore the cabinet out and put it in it looks like hell, it doesn't fit. But every time I use that cabinet, I remember my dad, and that I put that down. My father-in-law is an avid gardener, and he knew I like asparagus and raspberries, so he planted some in the garden. I had been in the States for a month on a tour, came home. There was my father-in-law waiting at the door, and he had a brown bag. He said, David, this is the first asparagus that came off, and I saved it for you. And I wrote that down. I built a tree house in the dogwood tree here for my children. And I wrote that down because they played countless hours in that. They used to drag animals off the street, even in Vancouver. You know, you have roadkill. We have an animal cemetery down there in the corner of the lot, and I wrote that down. And you know, as I began to write these things down, you know, my best friend came out and stayed for a week with us. I was building a fence along the waterside here, and he spent time carving a handle that we put on the gate. Every time I pull that gate open, I think of my best friend. And my mom, when she died, we put her ashes on a clematis plant. Every spring when that plant comes up, my mom is there.
Mhm.
And I put those things down and I said, those are the things that make this my home.
Yeah.
It's not a piece of real estate or property, it's my home. And to me, they are priceless. On the market, they are worthless.
Yeah.
They don't matter a damn. The most important things have no value in our economic system. Now, don't tell me that economic system isn't screwed up. And I think of Indigenous people who've walked on these lands for thousands of years, where every rock, every forest, every river bend is to them what is their home and sacred. And that has no economic value. That's what we've got to look at. This system is really screwed up because it's just the things that matter most have no value. Sorry,
No, that's a really important, it's a really important thought and emotion. And this is certainly the right place to have emotion because we're at Valentine's Day. And, you know, Valentine's Day is so often just focused on one type of love, romantic, sexual love, what can sell chocolates and jewelry and dresses and whatever. Those things are all really important too. But you know, this is a great way of teasing out some of these other dimensions of love. How it's not just that one-dimensional type of love, which is most profitable to the economy, but these other more nuanced understandings of love. And so I think that's a perfect segue to John. Dr. Burrows, as I've mentioned in my earlier comments, I've picked up tidbits here and there, listening to you speak about Zaagi'idiwin, and really. I won't take up any more seconds, but just to introduce you and thank you for coming and joining us this Zaagi'idiwin Valentine's event. And the floor is yours, Dr. Burrows.
Miigwech, Abuju Ndinwe Magani Dog, Nij Nishnabeg Dijmarzig, Bangietago Ninata Nishnabem, Giganos, Indigenous, Neashi Winningaming and Donjaba. Giganos Indigenous. Grateful to be able to be with you today and to understand the beauty of what we're gathering to do. Talk about Zaagi'idiwin. I learned about this idea from my friend, mentor, elder, Basil Johnson. And he said that the earth is our teacher, our professor. It gives us the knowledge that we need to be able to learn how we can discuss with one another how we should live. And so he talked about this idea of our treaties with the earth. We have treaties that we've made with the air and water and rocks and plants and insects and birds and animals. And in those treaties, we have relationships of care, relationships of sustenance, relationships that are about our emotions, binding one another together. And he talked to me about this idea of as long as the water flows, the grass grows, and the sun shines. And when he talked about the water, he talked about the river mouth being a zog. And this idea is pouring out of great nutrient and force that helps to nurture and sustain and gather all sorts of life. If you look at where river mouths are, you know, they collect nutrients for sometimes hundreds of miles through little tributaries, and you know, they eventually get together, and then they, in a main channel at a river mouth, deliver that so that you get a wide variety of life with all the microbial and bacterial that sustains the insects and then come along the fish, and with the insects and the fish, then come along the birds, and with the birds, then you get the animals there. And then of course, with all of that life, humans also find a great place for sustenance. And this idea of delivering in these channels life is this idea of Zaagi'idiwin. We're the Zaagi'idiwin Anishinaabe in our territory north of Toronto. And so delivering this Zaagi'idiwin, this way of life, is then a message for us in relationship to how we should act. We should act like the river mouths. We should be gathering energy from different parts of our world, delivering that as we collect it into a defined channel, which would allow for a great sustenance of life, a gathering of life. If you think about the gathering there at that river mouth, love is about sustaining a diversity of possibilities for people to live, and animals and plants and others to live richly in that area. If you're at all familiar with Ontario, you know about Mississauga or Mississauga, right? The great river mouth there is the way that's described. And this notion of learning about love by looking at the river mouth is what Basil was teaching me about our understanding of law. That is, law comes from looking around us at the natural world and then taking messages from the natural world into our own lives. And it's not just with the water, as long as the water flows, it's also the sun shines. The word for sun is gizis. It represents light, warmth, heat, and sight. Anasagewin, Waseawin, Gajatewin, Wabamawin. That is, the sun stimulates growth when it shines. It falls on everyone without discrimination. Its path across the sky represents steadiness. Its fire kindles what might otherwise be extinguished. There would be no life without this fire. And when we entered into treaties with the Crown, they recognized this. They also reasoned with us about the waters and the sun. Here's a quote: "When you turn your gaze towards the rising sun, you shall see that sun rising red, similar to the color of the coat I wear. When it rises higher, that same sun shall be very bright with light. It is in this image that there is life of your children. And after that, the sun has been up a little higher. You'll see in different places the flowers bloom. That is the image of the life of your children." Here's the Crown speaking to us about the features of the sun and what they bring forth from the earth in terms of light and life for children. And seeing all the flowers around us would be like seeing all of our children around us. We can apply these insights. We can be like the sun, right? This is relevant to how we treat others. Can you imagine practicing law or living life by drawing analogies from the sun? Like the sun, helping others to grow? Practicing law without discrimination, just being there for everyone? We can be dependable. We can revive those who lack vitality. And if we do so, we'll implement this aspect of Indigenous law as embedded in the treaties that are found in the natural world that the Crown itself spoke to us about. Let's think about this term, as long as the grass grows. How can you learn law from the grass? Meashkonsug. For Anishinaabe, grass is medicine. Mush kiki. Mush is the word for strength. Akit is the word for earth. That's plants. Mush kiki, the strength of the earth. The earth delivers power through a plant's veins, roots, stems, branches, and leaves. Emergence allows a plant to draw further life from the sun and the water. When Anishinaabe people observe grass and reason together about what it represents, we find standards for judgment. That is, we need to draw strength from one another. Think about law as medicine. Among our duties, we need to be a healing profession. Like the plants, we must give ourselves to others so that they can grow. And we must draw on others as a source of healing. An Anishinaabe chief put it this way during a treaty council, and I quote, "You see the sun above us? whose daily light shines and warms us. You also see these green leaves which open beneath its rays. We call that Sagibaga. You see that grass which clothes the earth, those waters which flow from the highlands towards the sea. Well, while these things live, your presence shall live. Can it be that this is forgotten? I love these teachings about water flow, sunshine, grass growing. Our treaties are to be for as long as the waters flow, the sun shines and the grass grows. Why? Because those teach us about how we should live, delivering in defined channels, opportunity for growth like water creates, shining, drawing power in and allowing that warmth and heat and light to be a part of how we interact with one another. And then with the plants, right, finding that way to draw up from the roots that we have, an ability to open ourselves up to the water, to the rain, or to other people, to be able to feel and live in accordance with these treaties. It's so wonderful when I think about my great-great-grandfather signing a treaty dealing with 1.5 million acres of land in Ontario and welcoming people into this relationship to learn about law from everything that surrounds us. And so I'm grateful for this time we have to talk about love, Zaagi'idiwin, right? This idea of flow, of energy, of light, of power, of strength, that we can be to one another as the rivers are, as the sun is, as the grass is. And I look forward to hearing from others here and then having a conversation about these things.
Lovely. Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Burrows. It's when you're talking about those early interactions, one of the things that really captures me is just the visual of the things that are described, but also what is perhaps as profound is that it really flies in the face of a misnomer that Europeans came to Canada, tricked and overpowered Indigenous peoples and conquered Indigenous peoples. Whereas the lesser known reality is that there was ingenious diplomacy and international relations that was happening actively for hundreds of years in leading up to the social innovation that we call Canada. And those insights that you've shared today and at the opening of the museum in Winnipeg a few years ago are really good reminders that the past is not as simple as we sometimes try to make it, and that there's this profound diplomacy that helped create what Canada is today, as distinct from the United States of America, as yes, sir, and as distinct from beautiful, beautiful. Wow, what a treasure. So those stories are just as important, and I feel that we're, in a way, the story of reconciliation, as chaotic as it is today, is an off-ramp for us as a society to rediscover our origin story. And it's a beautiful story that can help inform our future. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Feggy Wilson. Feggy is a citizen of the Métis Nation, and she's the president of Plenty Canada. You heard from the executive director of Plenty Canada earlier today, Elder Dr. Larry Mcdermott. She is currently working for the First Nations Information Governance Center and has worked at the intersection of Indigenous rights and environmental protection in positions at the United Nations Environment Program and the Federal Government of Canada, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, and the Assembly of First Nations. Thank you so much for being with us today, Feggy, from your home out east, a few hours ahead of me here. So the floor is yours. Please share your ideas.
Miigwech, Eli, and I'll start by saying Kwe and Miigwech to the Algonquin Nation for hosting me in their territory. Thank you for your comments. I caught a bit of the discussion with David Suzuki and John, your comments, and Eli, you nicely set me up for my my few comments today. So thanks for that. I want to talk about sharing as an expression of love today, celebration and joy and diversity. In coming together, in acknowledging our interconnections and all our relations. Before I do, I want to recognize the common philosophical foundations I have with the speakers here today of respect for the land captured in Indigenous laws as a common foundational principle for our societies. This respect, obligation, connection to the land is expressed in the language of love, as we've heard. Consider the expression, all my relations, which is a common expression, Lakota, Nakota, Dakota people out in the prairies, which embraces not only our human relations, but our non-human relations ones as well. This is familial love, the love of mother, father, sister, auntie. So even though I'm a lawyer, today I'm not going to talk about law. I'm going to talk about sharing as an act of love and show through my career and study of law how I've come to see love in plurilegalism, which is many sources of law brought together, and plurinationalism, which is many nations coming together. In 1994, I took a job with the United Nations Environment Program in Nairobi, Kenya, as a legal officer supporting the development of international legal instruments, and specifically regional seas agreements. One such agreement I was working on required me to travel to Iran, and this was in the 1990s. It was a challenging place, but I had a stop in Istanbul, Kenya, or Turkey, to purchase garments that I knew I was going to need to be a respectable lady in Muslim society. And I stopped in a small shop owned by a man who spoke no English. I spoke no Turkish, but I explained what I needed. And he asked me why I needed these things, you know, sort of in hand signals and trying to point at things. And his, you know, I tried to explain as best I could that I was working for the UN and I was going to Iran and I needed the proper attire. And I don't know how much he understood or how much I understood, but what he responded to my respect for the culture I was going to be traveling to was a gift of a headscarf, a beautiful silk headscarf, to honor the fact that I was honoring him and his culture. And it was a lovely moment of that connection across cultures, of respect, of caring for each other. In Iran then, when I went, I met with officials from countries that have been bitter enemies for centuries, and yet they were able to put the finishing touches to an agreement to protect the shared waters from hazardous waste. These were the waters of the Gulf Coast, or of the Arabian Gulf. Their interconnected reliance on the waters, their understanding of their need to share, triumphed any other motivations that they might have. I've been involved in many nation-to-nation negotiations at the United Nations, at the Assembly of First Nations, and involving First Nations and the nation-state of Canada over the ensuing years. These have required dialogue and discussion to find common ground and cooperation, but more fundamentally requiring a commitment to sharing and a shared purpose. Plurinational agreements based on our common need to share are necessary to coordinate our overlapping authority and obligations to care for the land. First Nations understood this need for mutual recognition and respect. It's not just First Nations, it's many, many Indigenous peoples around the world. This need to share. A treaty of the early 1800s witnessing a joint commitment from the English, French, and Algonquin nations is in fact referred to as the Welcome and Sharing Three-Figure Sacred Wampum Belt. Larry, you'll know this well. It signifies a commitment to share the land and the resources thereof. The Dish with One Spoon Treaty, which is in the Montreal territory, is another example of the recognition of the need to share. Parties to the treaty were welcome to take from the land, but each had to acknowledge obligations to ensure everybody benefited. My Master of Laws studies at Ottawa U in 2007 allowed me to draw together my experience and knowledge from roughly 15 years of work on environmental law, 10 of them at the intersection of Indigenous rights and environmental protection. In those studies, I confirmed my understanding of the interconnections between biological diversity and cultural diversity. Here's a simple way to think of it. Think of your favorite holiday and the foods that go with it. Chocolate, turkey dinner, or maybe in honor of Lunar New Year's today, noodles. Think of those holidays without those things. It's sad. Your joy is diminished. Your connection to the celebration, your tradition, your family, your friends, your culture, they're all diminished. While chocolate production is under threat from climate change, drought, and disease, the same with wheat and rice for making noodles, turkeys were almost extirpated from their traditional habitat in southern Ontario, where I grew up. I never saw one in the wild until I was in my 50s. When no one can no longer enjoy the foods, the traditions, the dances, the songs of our cultures, we lose our connection to the land. When our children lose that connection and their children, soon no one remembers that connection. What the food tasted like, what it was called, where it comes from, how to prepare it, how to grow it, how to protect it, even how to recognize it. If someone accidentally stumbles on it, no one remembers or cares for it. The love is gone. We and all our relations are diminished. Gary Nabin and Sarah Saint-Antoine call this the extinction of experience. Acknowledging our reliance on each other and the planet means celebrating our diversity. It means adopting a shared commitment to co-development, co-governance, and co-management to negotiate and implement our shared responsibilities to our human and other relations. A plurilegal and plurinational approach acknowledges this need to share. And whether we're sharing a box of chocolates, noodles for long life, or a dish with one spoon, what is that sharing but an act of love? Miigwech.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Fegi. And it's wonderful to hear about the depth of experience and the range of experience that you bring to the discussion today. Larry, as a part of the Plenty Canada sort of team here today, Larry has also stayed with us. And Larry, I'm just wondering if there's anything you'd like to add to Fegi's comments.
It'd be like double chocolate. Other than it was beautiful, and I'm still resonating with it. I love the analogy, with a meal, and with COVID, there's been so many incredible stories of innovation, drawing upon our traditions, but really the love within communities. And so when food security monies were rolled out, there really wasn't the capacity within the federal government to understand Indigenous food security, much less food sovereignty needs. That is, foods that are culturally important for the very reasons Fegi has just outlined. But yet there are people who have stepped up to the plate, and they're young and old who have worked together. It's that love for each other that then the knowledge along with the love and manifesting solutions. And as we all know, COVID has hit some of our First Nations and other Indigenous peoples disproportionately hard, but yet the resilience, the success stories come from really that foundation that Fegi just expressed.
Mhm.
So I feel honored and privileged to be working with many others in that what is known as a food security response. So we've been having meetings with federal officials, and just if nothing else, to help transform their thinking, understand that as one woman said, I don't need a cow in Attawapiskat, meaning that traditional agriculture has this narrow framework that needs to be expanded. And I love the way that I'm seeing, I know one 30-year-old who was chosen to speak to 5 ministers and spoke so strongly from the heart. And she woke them up. and there's good things happening since then, very good things. So that's what Feggy just provoked for me. Meanwhile, I'll look for a chocolate bar. Bye.
Thanks, Larry. Next, I'm honored to introduce Calvin Sanborn. Calvin has practiced environmental law for over 25 years as counsel for West Coast Environmental Law Association, the Farm Workers Legal Services Project, and the Forest Practices Board of British Columbia. He has extensive experience in both environmental litigation and successful lobbying for environmental reform, including the Historic Commission on Resources and Environmental Process. Professor Sanborn is the legal director of the Environmental Law Center at UVic and teaches the clinic. In 2011, he was named an honorary citizen of the city of Victoria and awarded the Andrew Thompson Award by West Coast Environmental Law, the province's top award for environmental advocacy, as well as multiple awards recognizing his commitment and contribution to environmental law. It's a pleasure to meet you this morning, Calvin, and I now invite you to turn your camera on. If
Yeah, Eli, I seem to be blocked, but it says the host is blocking my video.
let's turn on the videos.
Oh, okay.
Hosts, not, oh, there we go.
Oh, what a relief that is.
There you are, Calvin.
Half of my presentation is pictures. I was thinking, oh, I'll get very creative. I'll just describe these images. That's fantastic.
Okay. Floor is yours, sir.
I'm honored to join you today. So John asked me to talk about the work we've been doing with guardians. So the Environmental Law Clinic worked with the BC First Nations Energy and Mining Council and Indigenous Leadership Initiative in producing a report on guardians, the case for a guardian network initiative. And so this is basically a report to government and the public and to nations about the need for more guardian programs, the need for Canada to step up like Australia did to provide $700 million in the last 7 years and $700 million in the next 7 years to support their Aboriginal Rangers program. And I guess the way this fits into the theme today is that, as many people have talked about, Indigenous culture is very much based on relationship and relationship with nature and community. And the argument that we made in our report is that guardians can be a way of strengthening relationships between colonial society and Indigenous society to the benefit of everyone, to the benefit of non-Indigenous and Indigenous society. And because the guardian programs provide benefits to strengthen Indigenous communities and also benefits to manage the natural world, that the better management of the natural world can come out of this. So basically what we talked about was this incredible renaissance of Indigenous guardians. So the traditional guardians that go back to, and I'm just going to start showing some pictures. It's sort of like 1950s television, as I pointed out the other day. So this is the original guardian, the uncle of Frank Brown in the Housekeeping territory. And the report is dedicated to him and to all the guardians historically. But what we're seeing now is across Canada, and we've looked at 70 guardian programs in Canada, mostly Canada, but around the world. We have the guardians like the Silcoteen Rangers that are protecting the wild mushrooms and the forests of the Silcoteen. We have the coastal guardians, the coastal First Nations boats that are patrolling their territory and monitoring and avoiding overfishing and poaching. And you've got the Haida Watchmen that are protecting the cultural heritage of their territory. We have the groups in Australia. So this is a global phenomenon. We have the Australian Rangers that I mentioned are receiving massive support from the Australian government because of the benefit that they provide to the non-Indigenous community as well as the Indigenous community by building tourism and by sharing traditional knowledge of fire management, which is the best way of reducing fire hazards. And I'll speak a bit more about that in a moment. But across British Columbia, we have the Kitasoo Hey Guardians that are fending off the grizzly poachers. We've got the West Moberly Nation Guardians that are protecting and restoring the caribou herds. We have guardian groups that are monitoring the environmental health of their society and their territory because they are applying traditional knowledge, which is that ancient knowledge of really looking and observing and watching these cycles of nature and knowing nature. And so in our report, we talk about the remarkable benefits that communities are getting, that are jobs for young people in places where jobs are needed in the remote communities. We talk about the training that young people are getting in biology, in archaeology, in law enforcement, in computer skills, in GPS, in mechanics for boats and ATVs, all those sorts of things. So we talk about the, let me just look for my archaeology. Oh, so, you know, the archaeology knowledge that the Comox Guardians are gaining, and the kelp monitoring knowledge and biological knowledge that's happening up around the Hakai, around Hakai. And the other benefits include enhancing the capacity of individuals and communities, building a tourism industry, like the Nuu-chah-nulth Guardians that educate tourists about their culture and help to contribute to tourism. Perhaps most importantly, Guardian programs contribute to a sense of community, self-governance, well-being, and pride. They improve nutrition and health as they safeguard the country foods and the medicinal plants that enhance health. The Guardian programs are gathering information about what is the health of the water, what is the health of the wildlife population. So using traditional knowledge, they're gathering this information that is giving nations the ability to self-govern, to make decisions about land use planning, to make decisions distinguishing between good development and bad development. And perhaps most important, Guardians are a wonderful mechanism for encouraging the elders to pass on traditional knowledge. And that traditional knowledge is key to the whole thing that we talk about here, that that Indigenous people monitored their wildlife in ways that colonial science ignored. So that when James Michener in the book Alaska talks about how the first colonials came and saw the fishing weirs on the coast and saw, oh, this is a great way to catch fish. And they took all the fish because they ignored the law, take a little, leave a lot. And similarly with the herring fishery, the DFO ignored the Housekeeping elders who said, do not do a kill herring fishery, do the traditional herring spawn on kelp fishery. And one of the most significant things, I think, is that on Smokey the Bear came along after World War II, and they said, oh, forget about this traditional burning stuff. we have to suppress fires. And so what happened was that the forest changed. So Dr. Paul Hesburgh at the University of Montana has the photographs of how the mountains changed in the last 100 years, where the forests had gaps in them from traditional burning, because the indigenous people had done this burning to enhance wildlife. And 100 years later, there are no gaps because the traditional burning is gone. And now we have these out of control wildfires. And now the Western scientists, like Dr. Paul Hesburgh, are saying, oh, we have to go back to traditional burning. So now there are all these projects happening in British Columbia, restoring traditional burning, getting nations to do that. And we're saying that guardians should be doing that, but Indigenous people have been doing this for centuries. So these are the Aboriginal rangers who are practicing their traditional burning. And this is coming back now with, it's a bit low tech here. Lana Lowe, Fort Nelson First Nation, who's doing the burning to restore the bison habitat in the Fort Nelson First Nation. And again, an elder in Australia doing his traditional burning. And the result, of course, is the result of restoring the habitat for the bison. This is what happens after the Fort Nelson First Nation does their burning. Then the bison have grass to eat and they come in and they get restored. And so I guess the love message here really is that the United Nations has done a report. Scientific American has done a report saying that the most optimal resource management is resource management that doesn't bring colonial ways of approaching fishing weirs, but it actually integrates the best of colonial science, the best of David Suzuki's brain and all those UBC scientists, and integrates the GPS and the computers with traditional knowledge. And that is actually what guardians are doing. They're out with the GPS, they're using their computers, but they're also listening to the elders. And the United Nations, as I say, and Scientific American have done publications talking about this is the way through. This is the healing. And so at the end of our report, we talk about how government needs to give money to guardians to heal the lands and waters that have been damaged over the last 150 years. So the oil and gas industry is now paying to restore the damage done by oil and gas wells. $3 billion of damage. Jobs should go to Indigenous guardians to restore that. Similarly, there are 1,200 mines across British Columbia, many of which are killing the fish streams of the, it's like Jordan River, all the salmon were gone, all the salmon were killed off at Solom River. Who better to fix that than Indigenous guardians? And so basically, I guess the healing story, the love story is that we can bring together colonial science, colonial money, traditional knowledge, and heal the lands and waters. Thank you.
That's beautiful, Calvin. And, as you were speaking and the 1950s technology, nice touch, I became more curious as to what motivated you personally to get involved in this work. And so maybe gather your thoughts as we go to our next speaker. And because when we come back around in conversation, I want to have a dialogue, of course, about the subject matter that we've had, but also how each of you were motivated to get involved in the work that you do, and really, and that's part of our love service in the work that we do. So on that note, I'd like to introduce Jackie Miller. Jackie holds a Master's of Arts degree in Political Science and Cultural, Social, and Political Thought from the University of Victoria. She's a member of the first cohort in the University of Victoria Faculty of Law's Juris Indigenorum Doctor program. in Canadian common law and Indigenous legal orders. Jackie has extensive experience working with and in support of Indigenous peoples in BC, in the North and across the country. A strong history of environmental activism and organizing, and years of work in socioeconomic impact assessment and monitoring. She is a settler Canadian of European ancestry, living and working and studying in the territories of the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples, also known as Victoria and Saanich, British Columbia. Jackie's pursuing her degree in law to strengthen her impact and working for a just and respectful relationship between Canadians and Indigenous peoples and between their governments. Jackie is a lead organizer for the Reconciling Ways of Knowing Indigenous Knowledge and Science Forum, which of course is one of our co-host organizations for today. Jackie O, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Eli. So I'm going to change what my plan was a little bit, and just listening to some of the others speak, I remember, like, one of my key reasons for being here that really connects to love is my love of the earth, which really goes back to road trips that I took with my mother and sister as a young child to go visit my grandparents. And I just remember as a child being struck by sedimentary rock and finding it fascinating. And one of my first passions in life was to become an earth scientist. And I studied that pretty avidly in high school, and I started out in university studying that. And in the end, I moved away from that on a theme that ties to our discussion tomorrow, because I basically received a message as a woman growing up in the educational system in which I grew up in, that physics wasn't a place for me. And we could maybe pick up on some of that a little bit more tomorrow, but it brought me to other places. And ultimately I ended up working for the government of the Northwest Territories, doing social impact assessment for them for quite a long time, or a number of years. And I decided to return back to the Southwest coast to be closer to my family. And that's when I connected with Miles Richardson, who is one of the conveners for the Reconciling Ways of Knowing project and will be a speaker tomorrow, who has been since then one of my greatest teachers. And through that, I just want to connect the theme that I think runs throughout a number of these discussions of relationships and relationality, which I really think is part of the core theme that I'll be speaking about and runs through the rest of this. And so, as you noted in my bio, in 2018, I joined the Joint Canadian Common Law and Indigenous Legal Orders program when it started, and have been learning from within Canadian common law and diverse Indigenous legal traditions from across Turtle Island since then. And this experience has really revealed to me a key difference between the Western worldview underlying the Canadian common law system and many Indigenous legal orders and ways of knowing, which is that while the individual is the center of the show in the Western worldview, with a basket of mostly negatively defined rights and limited responsibilities, in many Indigenous orders, embeddedness within a web of relationships undergirds their entire legal orders. And I want to provide an illustration from my transsystemic torts law course that I took with Dr. Sarah Morales, who taught us torts from a Canadian common law and Coast Salish legal perspectives. So tort law is the law of involuntary obligations, which isn't in and of itself obvious to a lot of members of the public what that means. So voluntary obligations are contracts, for example, which we choose to enter into, but we have obligations to each other that we just have. And so negligence is one core area of tort law. So I've explained to others, for example, one has a duty to look backwards when driving their car out of their driveway. So we have to be thoughtful about our impacts on others. And in the Canadian common law, to find someone negligent, first one must establish that one owes that person a duty of care. And there are all sorts of tests that are involved in this, and without going into all of the details, I won't try to teach tort law, maybe ever, or certainly not in this session. What I do want to emphasize is that within the Canadian common law, one is not presumed to have a duty of care to everyone. There are specific definitions of when that duty kicks in. What I learned in this course, however, is that in the Coast Salish world, kinship relations weave across the entire legal order, including beyond the realm of the nuclear family and even those alive today. And for example, in the Cowichan legal order, first ancestors are in the landscape directly. And in other Coast Salish legal traditions, other ancestors may have changed form into other species and elements of the natural world. And some examples that we learned about include children who turned into a killer whale, someone who turned into a salmon, and someone who turned into a rainbow. And these transmutations and these stories about the transmutations many generations ago connect the living generation to those past and to the stories, lessons, and laws that come from those times. And so I tell this story to share the idea that the duty of care in the Canadian common law is really just a hint of what it could be, and that it could be so much more as a program like this, and as we have further conversations within our society across our ways of knowing and our ways of being, of what the Western world and the common law legal order can learn from Indigenous legal orders that center relationality and connectedness with all of creation, and the responsibility for and to each other and creation that comes with this relationality. With these relationships and the duty of care, comes a much deeper responsibility. And also I think I'd like to just highlight that this idea of a duty of care really connects with a core discussion that feminists really brought forward to challenge the framework of individualism, detachment, and entitlement that's so deeply embedded in the Western worldview and in Western legal thought. In this worldview that privileges and separates men over women, mind over body, adults over children, and humans over and apart from the rest of creation. Feminists have really brought forward the idea that care is essential to what we need to center and how we think about our place in the world, as a way of challenging the social and political order that produces these violences that stem from and are fed by these binaries, as a means of healing and deconstructing our power relations that harm men, women, two-spirit people, and all of our relations. And so in thinking about all of this as well, and as I have taken some time as someone in this program and learning from people like Miles and from John and Sarah and a number of others, it started to, well, I think there are two kind of takeaways for someone like me as an ally, and both of which I think really involve thinking about changing ourselves. And the first one is that I've really clearly thought that someone like me, I have an obligation, a responsibility, and the task of changing Canada. So if I am someone who identifies as a Canadian, this isn't something that I can leave to others or to the experts. If I'm a Canadian, I have to own this, and there are things that I need to do. And I think we all have different kind of pieces of the puzzle that we can do in that, but I really kind of want to emphasize, I don't think we can leave it to others and to the experts. We're all part of it. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is that thinking about Indigenous legal orders, which was not really something that I was aware of growing up, but I feel really honored to have had the opportunity to learn a lot more about, it's really helped me to resist certain ideas of fatalism about the necessity of capitalism already having won, and that there isn't anything that we can do about it. It's really given me the knowledge and the responsibility that the game is not over, And I want to say, like, I don't think this is a message about hope, which I think is a passive position, and it leaves things either to the experts or a deus ex machina. And I don't think it's ridiculous to say that we can change capitalism. I think it really follows from the fact that there are multiple legal orders in this place, that most of which have been ignored for too long, but are not extinguished, that we have a legal and a political and a moral responsibility to go through the process of working out changes to the system that need to happen for the laws of the land to be respected, so we can all move forward together appropriately.
That is lovely. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jackie. And what strikes me immediately is how your original observation as a young person of the sedimentary rocks, these formations of Mother Earth, the layers, and how Mother Earth, in a way, in your love for Mother Earth, let's call it geophilia. As an extension of what David Suzuki introduced as ecophilia from the author that he referenced, whose name escapes me just now, but how that love of the mother brought you into this deeper story. And partly what it's like, in my mind, what you represent in this dialogue is an ideal case of the type of learning journey that we would want for settlers to become allies. To go from just settling, this notion of settling the West, and I know a lot of young people are still introducing themselves as settlers, but really what, and how you've ended your talk there, Jackie, is around being an ally. And it reminds me of, in 2017, John, Dr. Nancy Turner, who is part of the Reconciling Ways of Knowing. She was a Trudeau scholar. She was the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation sponsored a series of discussions that year. And John Ralston Saul attended the event for Nancy Turner in Victoria here, and he talked about the origin of sovereignty. And that in Canada, sovereign power and authority doesn't originate from a magical crown with precious gems in the halls of power in Ottawa. That sovereignty actually originates in each and every citizen of this country, and we entrust that sovereign power and authority to the government to wield on our behalf collectively. And I think about how that there's all of these points of light, like Jackie and others who are Canadian citizens who are wakening up to the true nature of what Canada is and how that's connected to ideas of Indigenous love, really. And so I want to come full circle back to talk about how, this story of Canada and the as long as the grass grows, the river flows, and the sun shines, we will live in parallel sovereignty as brothers and sisters. How that hasn't quite made it through on one side of the relationship, that the education of citizenship, and this is what intrigues me so much about folks like Dr. Sanborn and others who have been compelled to get involved in this enterprise of nation building or nation rebuilding here in Canada. And I'm wondering, with those very compelling stories that you share, Dr. Burrows, about treaty making, what kinds of reflections or directions or guidance can you offer in terms of educating all of those points of light in sovereign authority and how we need to exercise that sovereign authority collectively in this endeavor that we call Canada, as the fact that we're all treaty people at the end of the day?
Where treaties have been signed, that's the case. And of course, they've not been agreed to everywhere. And so law is a verb in Algonquian languages. Nakonage, one of the words for law, means it was something we do rather than something that's done to us. And if law is something we do, then it's never ending. It's always a part of each generation's task to pick up what's been given to us by our ancestors and make the best we can today to help our children tomorrow. And this idea of law as a verb is then something we conjugate rather than classify. Think about law as a conjugation, or think about us as conjugating, meaning we're trying to put together relationships of different types that might be asymmetrical in one instance, because we all have different gifts and talents and possibilities. And so that's one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it is just developing friendships. Living treaties is to live with friendship. Our trees are about peace and friendship and respect. I showed this belt earlier of people linking arms together. Calvin's my good friend. I appreciate walking with him around Brentwood Bay, visiting him in his office, seeing the students that he's encouraging. I feel that with Jackie. She's an amazing student. Being in my class, learning from her, she shared with me the things that she was experiencing, and she's got a lot of knowledge and experience. And so it's those friendships that are the living aspects of our treaties. And so I know you wanted to ask Calvin about what got him into this as well, and might be an opportunity for him to say what his sort of pull to this field is.
Sure. So my pull came from Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King probably had more influence on me than anybody, because he was a Black man in the 1960s who had a revolutionary message, which was that we are not separated between Black and white, women and men, Indigenous, non-Indigenous. His fundamental message was that we were all part of a beloved community, that we should all be in community, which is very relevant for our theme here. And I just found that such a powerful message. And then as I went along in my life, I read Aldo Leopold, the great wildlife biologist, and he said that in the history of society, we had a very narrow definition of what community was. So it was basically white European males. And then we decided, okay, so we're going to extend community to, after the Civil War, Black people could vote. And then, okay, eventually women were included in the 1920s to vote. And then he said, but the big challenge is to extend that community to nature and recognize something that Indigenous people have known forever, which is that sister cedar is part of our family. The salmon are part of our community. And so it's very gratifying. One of the great honors and privileges of my life has been to work with Indigenous people in British Columbia to learn about sister cedar and about community. And yeah, it's just a wonderful thing.
It's lovely to hear Martin Luther King's name. He's also somebody that has inspired me as well. I'm sure many others who are with us today. And recognizing that even the one who does harm is the one who we may perceive to be the victor in a relationship of master and slave is equally as dysfunctional and unhealthy to the master as it is to the slave. And I'm always reminded of an interview that I heard in 2014 on CBC radio. I believe it was October 4th in 2014, when a retired RCMP officer was interviewed about his role in basically abducting a child from an Indigenous family to bring to a residential school, and how that one act on one day of his young career, and he was just following orders, how it crippled him and ruined his life later in life, how it stayed with him and just brought him to a mental breakdown. in something that was damaged in his own humanity when he participated in something so horrific as tearing a child from the arms of his mother. And so these stories, these compounding stories, we try to simplify them as state interactions, but at the end of the day, we're all human beings caught up in various aspects of this unfolding. So yes, thank you for sharing that, Calvin. And as we're nearing, well, actually, by golly, it's 11 o'clock on the dot here. This has been a very rich dialogue and has set the stage beautifully for the 3 days. I'm a bit of a glutton, so I'll stick around with whoever else wants to stick around and continue to dialogue, and we can start letting some other folks into the room. But I want to thank all of the panelists who've spent their time with us today, and invite all of you to check out the rest of our proceedings for the next 2 days in however you'd like to. There's also, as Jackie mentioned at the outset, that there's going to be some recordings that we share. And as I had mentioned, this is going to become an annual tradition of ours to continue to overwrite Valentine's Day with Zaagi'idiwin and other concepts of Indigenous love. So kleko to all of you. Have a good, and Larry, I invite you to share some closing words.
Okay, Eli, I was just thinking about, and I know we're into overtime already, but I was thinking about the words of the Crown when at the end of the War of 1812, a war in which thousands of Indigenous peoples participated, and so all but one of the First Nations that were present at the Treaty of Niagara, a follow-up to the Proclamation of 1763. And at that time, the Crown actually produced a wampum belt. In fact, I have a replica right over here, and if time permitted, I'd pull it out. But it has these wavy parallel lines. And so the Crown, the Crown said it will be our love and affection that will get us through the challenges of the future. And the wavy lines represented those challenges. So they used the very words, love and affection. And I thought that was appropriate. I think that's an appropriate way to close, other than Miigwech, Kiji Manadu for the wonderful minds and hearts that have been shared today. It's been an honor and a privilege just to listen and share, and look forward to the next couple of days. Miigwech.
Thank you, Larry. 2.